We will call to order the October meeting of the Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee meeting. And as normal, we'll take the consent agenda and then move to the general agenda. Are there items on the consent agenda that members of the committee would like to be pulled? And then we'll move to the housing cases.
Move for approval of the consent agenda.
Well, move to the housing cases.
Housing
We'll go
cases.
through. Yep. Did have information from staff that item C6 will need to be pulled as there will be a VDA for that item. Item C7 to be pulled. There will be a VDA in place for that item as well. Now, are there individuals present today for a demolition case? You came here today because you received notice that your property was scheduled for hearing on the demolition case? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion for approval of the balance absent of those two cases, but I would ask council to reserve the right, because we did adjust the timing, that if someone comes in later, that we would revisit those cases.
Move for approval of the balance of the consent agenda, excluding C6 and C7.
I'll second.
That's moving properly second. All in favor? Vote yes. Those opposed, no. All right. With that, we'll move item G1.
Item G1, information on proposed fence ordinance. This item was continued from the April, June, and September meetings of the Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Before you are some revisions, and this item today is just for information. There were some additional revisions made to the proposed fence ordinance since the last time we met, specifically to make clear that the new requirements do not apply within historic districts, historic overlay districts, and for local historic landmark properties. Secondly, at the request of Councilmember McIntosh, the proposed ordinance now prohibits the use of what we colloquially know as cinder block, but concrete masonry units, using that material for the building of portions of fences or walls. There is an exception, however, for decorative masonry units such as split face block. Finally, there was a provision that has now been added at the request of Councilmember Larson, requiring that the finished sides of fences must face adjoining properties on all sides. The memo does outline some concerns planning staff has with it. I'll be happy to address any questions or concerns today. But I did want to say this is an evolving ordinance. I've already received some feedback and concerns from members of the committee and council. Again, I'll be happy to take those today, or in the interest of time, I know it's a full agenda. Please feel free to reach out to me or Ms. Carmen with any feedback that you may have.
All right. I'll take any questions, comments, or direction from committee members. Mr. Clark?
Could you reiterate with these changes what would be permitted in the front of the house?
In the front of the house, if the fence is more or less than 50% in opacity, meaning you can see through more than 50% of the fence, there would be no height restrictions on the fence. However, if the fence is greater than 50% in opacity, meaning you cannot see through it, and is not made of masonry foundation, then you would be limited to a 4-foot height along the front perimeter of your house.
When you say perimeter, you mean simply the front or the front sides back to the house?
The front sides back to the house. I've got a little diagram. I don't know if anyone can assist me in
We'll get the screen.
putting this up.
You have to do something. There we go.
I don't know how visible that is, but you will see the the front footprint of that residence is in a brighter red, so the fence requirements, the height requirements would apply along both those front side portions of the yard in addition to the street frontage portion
Could you
of the house.
touch the street frontage?
Sure.
What you're showing is a fence that doesn't go across the front, that I can tell. Just the red is only the sides and the back.
Yeah, I think the color differentiation is hard to see on that screen, so I'm gonna...
Yeah, that's what I'm at. What would have to happen here?
From there forward, that 4-foot limitation would, as it's written today, would apply for fences that had an opacity of greater than 50% and did not have a masonry foundation.
That's all.
Adams?
Yes, you gave us a report with all of the minute details. And since this is for information, could you resend this to the council so they can see your visuals that you gave us, which were quite,
Absolutely, yes.
you do
In your
Does it
prior
explain
packet,
it? Yeah.
there'll be, number one, that's good for visuals. Two,
Yeah.
once you do give us feedback, our goal is to do some public outreach to see, in fact, the public's position on whatever it is that we end up proposing before we take it forward to the planning board.
I think what might happen is we're going to get some public comment on this one. Because as staff has said, you would have to grandfather a whole bunch of properties and businesses and everything else. I think your recommendations, for me, they work for me. But again, I think it would be helpful if you would just go ahead and send the report out to the council again.
Absolutely.
Okay?
McIntyre?
That actually covered my question as well.
Yeah.
All right. Mr. Larson, was that?
Yeah, I found the report somewhat awkward and difficult. Are we dealing with walls? Are we dealing with fences? 10-foot high cyclone fence in the front yard bothers me as a possible alternative. I just think we need a little more work on this, and I've relayed most of my concerns to staff, and I'm sure they'll work through them.
I have a couple to add there. One, depending upon where you are, what neighborhoods you're in, these have different impacts. And so there's some neighborhoods, some communities that see that we face that have completely bricked walls that go out the entire perimeter of footprint of the home, and then even in some of the developments that they have these brick perimeters that go around the neighborhoods as well. And so I'm sure that in those areas we're going to want to hear what that means and what that looks like. Has this been something that we've, asked home builders associations and others to kind of give us some feedback on?
At this point, we have not. We wanted to get some initial feedback and direction from council and then go out with whatever we come up with.
All right. And then in addition to that, on the cylinder block components of that could not be utilized at all in the construction of the fence, or it could not be the final?
It could not be the final. In other words, if you were to put a layer of
Face it
stucco,
stone.
then at that point it would become a decorative.
Got it. All right. That was a clarity that I wanted also. And then also on the components there, that was, I think it was requested by Councilman Larson on that all finished faces are extend outward. I agree with the staff's comments in reference to that in terms of how that can become a problematic issue. Now, I think the goal sounds like it is to ensure that the more attractive face of it is towards the public. And I can see that in terms of where we're looking at if it's facing front to the street. But if I have woods behind my house, I don't understand why I would then need to have a finished face facing the woods behind my house rather than facing inward on that. So I think there's some work that we can look at. If the goal is to ensure what is aesthetically pleasing faces outward to the public, I think you can get there without requiring all faces and certain conditions to be met based upon where it is. And if I'm mistaking your goal, Councilmember Larson, on that, please correct me. Is it to ensure that you get?
Yeah, I think whether you're dealing with from a public sidewalk as somebody walking by and looking at this, or if you're a neighbor and somebody has put up a fence, how that impacts your personal life on your property.
Right. Okay. All right. And those are the only ones that I had. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Item G2.
Item G2, ordinance amending chapters A and B of the Unified Development Ordinances to change the standards for outdoor lighting, UDO 286, proposed by Planning and Development Services, recommended by Planning Board.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of council. Light pollution is often discussed when new development is proposed, especially when it's close to residential uses. And although there is a lighting provision currently in the UDO, it doesn't specify acceptable lighting levels or fixture types. Legacy 2030 recommends consideration of a light pollution ordinance, and an amendment addressing light trespass and glare was proposed in a report on performance standards that was presented to the Planning Board in June 2017. This top bullet is our current lighting ordinance. It's the whole thing. Where a buffer yard is required pursuant to section B 3.5, outdoor lighting shall be shielded and oriented as to cast no direct light onto adjacent property. There are also some standards in a couple of other zoning districts, MRBS and the E zoning districts. But that's really all there is in the ordinance. So under the direction of the Planning Board, planning staff consulted with peer cities, Duke Energy, lighting experts, and some stadium lighting specialists, held a couple of citizen meetings and sent out an online survey to gather feedback as we developed this ordinance. We held the 2 citizen meetings in May 2018, had total 20 attendees, and we sent out the online survey with help of marketing and communications, and we got 166 survey responses. And these were responding to an early iteration of this ordinance. Some comments that we heard was that it might be too expensive for recreation uses, particularly little leagues and schools, that many existing stadium lighting fixtures were already taller than 80 feet. That was part of the ordinance. Should address residential uses and should follow dark sky standards, which call for very low light levels. The purpose of the ordinance that we drew up would standardize lighting standards for new development, control light trespass onto residential property and the public right-of-way, would reduce glare, and address lighting problems from recreation uses. This would only apply to new development. It would not be for single-family residential development, not for townhomes, duplexes, or twin homes. It wouldn't be for repairs or maintenance of existing lighting, and it would not address streetlights. Under the light trespass part of the ordinance, a lighting plan would be required, and that would need to demonstrate that a light reading at the residential property line and the public right-of-way would need to be 1/2 foot candle. You can see in the illustration on the left, the top part shows light kind of trespassing into residential property. The lighting plan would need to demonstrate that the light at that property line would be 1/2 foot candle, which is the industry standard, and it's a low amount of light. It's technically the amount of light 1 foot away from a burning candle, and it's 1/2 of that, so it's pretty dim. The ordinance also addresses glare. Glare is when you can see that lighting filament, and it looks like this picture. And it addresses that through regulation of parking lot lighting. We have full cutoff fixtures required for parking lots at a height of a 30-foot pole height with a 2-foot base. And this is kind of a balance so that it limits the number of the number of lighting fixtures needed for that parking lot. You have very low pole heights, you need more fixtures, and therefore you're kind of defeating the purpose of trying to control glare when you have too many lighting fixtures. So this is the balance that we came to. And then the ordinance also addresses recreation uses at stadiums, would require glare control package, 80-foot maximum height for new fixtures, and then it has, this is again an industry standard, a maximum 7,500 candela at 150 feet from the playing field. This limits glare and light trespass. This is another measurement of that, and you can kind of see in this picture, this is a lighting array with glare control, and this is one without it. And then we also are grandfathering existing athletic facilities with conventional lighting in this ordinance revision. This is something that we heard from several times from Little Leagues and schools, particularly Wake Forest, who have a lot of investment and have not heard from neighbors about being bothered by their athletic facilities. So as long as they keep their lighting to conventional lighting, instead of going to LED, which are brighter and cause more glare, then they're grandfathered in. If they convert to LED, then they need to follow these standards. So in summary, proposed standards would benefit the community, protect neighborhood character, improve aesthetics. They're in line with our peer studies, lighting ordinances, and the ordinance would still provide site and building sign flexibility at a cost similar to current standards, and it would reduce the need to use lighting conditions as part of special use zoning cases, although that would still be possible if there was a situation where you needed higher standard of light control. And the planning board unanimously recommended approval of UDO 286 at their July public hearing, with one person coming out in support of the ordinance and none opposed. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
All right, Councilman Adams.
Yes, with this ordinance, and we pass it, let's say Monday, with the plans going on right now for Reynolds football field, would they have to adhere to this UDL standard, or would they?
They would, and we've actually talked to the contractor who's doing the stadium lighting, and they say that their current lighting plan would follow these. It falls in line with these standards, with the candela and the light trespass and everything else. But everything they have planned for it is within these standards already.
Okay. And just so we're clear, when we have to replace lighting, city streets, other places, let's say a retail center, but I think you said they're exempt, retail, commercial.
No, it would, if the commercial property fronted on a public street, light for new development, the light wouldn't be able to trespass into that public street or residential property that it touches, but for all existing commercial development, this doesn't apply. It's just for new or complete redevelopment.
Okay, so when you have to replace lighting, if you are the city or developers or anybody or any pre-existing already,
This wouldn't apply.
this wouldn't apply. Okay, thank you.
Clark? Two things. It would seem like to me that if a commercial development fronted a public street, we would want some of the light in the street, because that's why we put street lights up.
Well, this would stop glare from entering the public street, which could be a safety hazard for drivers. And it would keep that light trespass to a minimum.
Okay. The other one is, I will not support this if we exclude ourselves. I think it should apply to new street lights. You know, government has a reputation of passing rules that apply to everybody but themselves, and we're getting ready to do that. And I have gotten complaints on the new LED street lights that they do interfere. I had a couple that had to buy new drapes for the front of their house because the thing is so bright. So,
Jump in.
you know, if it's such a good idea, why doesn't it apply to us?
Good afternoon, council members. Just to address your question, Councilmember Clark, this ordinance would, in fact, treat the city the same as it would private petitioners, in the sense that all private property lights of those categories that Kelly mentioned in the presentation are treated equally. No street lights are regulated under this ordinance, and that's because Duke Power, basically in conjunction with the city, goes in and installs those street lights, updates them, etc. But since this is the UDO, we really only deal with things that are on private property in the UDO. The city code and other places are where we generally would deal with things relating to the rights of way.
I don't buy that. The complaints I get on the new LEDs is that they're too bright inside people's houses. And I think if it's just a good idea for everyone else, it should be a good idea for us.
Mr. City Manager?
I would suggest we can, I don't have DOT staff here right now, but we could, if you want to hold this, we can come back with some more information about Duke Power, their street lighting initiative, all those issues related to that, what our authority is to regulate them. I mean, I don't think it happens. If they want to hold it, they can handle it.
Absolutely. The staff isn't, and the planning board isn't in any rush on this
Right.
item. We're certainly glad to discuss this offline and bring you back some information from Duke related to this issue at your next meeting.
But I will go on the record that it should apply to all lights equally. And I have gotten complaints on new LED lighting that is too bright inside their house from a street light.
Let the record reflect Councilmember Clark's
Yeah.
comments.
Thank you.
Mrs. McIntyre?
I'll yield to Dee Dee.
In certain neighborhoods in our city, we want bright. So I need you guys to look at that too, and how this would affect our communities. Because if the crime is there, let's be real, we're not interested in dark. We're interested in light, okay?
My question goes along the lines of retrofitting city property, for instance, Haynes Park on the tennis courts, and I'm sure everybody's got a recreation facility in their ward where there's, intense lighting. Do we have a plan to address that? Probably not an ordinance thing. It's more of a policy management.
At this point, I don't believe we have one. I know we've been looking at all our facilities. As I understand the ordinance, if we were totally redoing it, all of the lighting, then we'd have to meet the requirements. But
Right.
at this point, I don't think, Tasha, we have any lighting plan to meet the. But we could bring you some information.
But there's a life cycle on
Right.
the actual bulbs. I mean, so should we make policy to say that as we replace with the new standard?
We can look at that and we can bring that back as well. Yeah.
And then there's no sunset provision, no grandfathering provision for after some period of time, existing older ones have to comply.
No,
with it.
there's not a provision like that.
Okay, thanks.
My recollection from previous public works discussions is that the city has the authority to ask Duke for the cutoff fixtures. It's just an extra cost. Is that? I'm sure. I don't know if there's anyone here from staff who is familiar with the history of that review.
We have a certain amount of authority to ask for certain types of structures, but I'm not the expert. So there are limits. I know as far as glare protection and things like that. So bring it back.
Yeah, I mean that's a perfectly valid inquiry. It's one that we could handle through city policy. It wouldn't have to be and it could be adopted in conjunction with approval of an ordinance. Wouldn't have to cycle back through the planning board for us to do it.
Yeah, I did want to endorse Ms. Adams' comment.
You endorsing me?
And that gets back to my question on why there's certain areas you would want the lighting to stop at a certain place. I think there are places you'd like it to go everywhere.
Absolutely.
And I'm thinking Miller Park's a pretty big city park, and down in those trees at night, you would want some of those to be reasonably bright. I don't know if I've got a park that big. But I do think there are just different circumstances, and it's going to be tough to write this, but I think safety is a legitimate concern too. In those cases, we want it right.
Right.
And the way the ordinance is written, it stops late trespass between properties owned by different people. So if the city was lighting Miller Park, for instance, the light would have to stop at the property lines of Miller Park. They don't want to light, the people's houses next door to Miller Park. They want to light Miller Park. The same with the commercial property that is proximate to residential property. It's not about parking lots next to each other. If one parking lot's lighting bleeds into another parking lot's lighting, that isn't an issue. But one parking lot's lighting bleeds into the houses behind the commercial property, then that would be an issue with this ordinance.
And I would, in hearing, go ahead, Councilman Bessie, I'll come back.
No, go ahead.
I was going to state in terms of with the comments that are there, in terms of looking at and hearing what's at issue, again, with the UDO component, and then the other side of it, I think, is internal policy questions in terms of how do we approach what we do as a city in reference to neighborhoods and others with lighting, and the type of lighting that we request specific to how it impacts neighborhoods and community. That may not be something that we want to write into the UDO, but more so in terms of how we want to structure internal policy to, as it stated, to walk side by side with that. But, Councilman Bessie.
A couple of considerations. There are three elements that this is primarily intended to control. There's uplight, backlight, and glare. There is no public safety value whatsoever to uplight. That's just wasted lumens. There's a valid question, and there's no public safety value to glare. That's a traffic hazard. There are situations where you can make an argument that there is public safety value to backlight, but then there are a lot of neighborhoods that don't want the backlight. The street light is designed to be street lighting, and to be effective about that, but not designed to keep people awake at night by glaring through their curtains. In terms of park lighting, it's interesting that in the Miller Park planning process, there was substantial discussion of the lighting plans there and the pros and cons of lights and where they would be. And there were a number of factors being considered there. One was you want the parking lots to be well lit at night, because that's where you do get the illicit traffic issues. On the other hand, you don't want the wild areas, the wildlife areas, the natural areas of the park to be lit up at night, because that destroys a substantial part of the value that the community loves about that park. When you have a lot of light in those areas, you disrupt the nocturnal wildlife that the neighbors and the residents of the area love to have there. So, there are reasons why you don't want bright lights back in the woods where you're not supposed to have users after dark anyway. You just want to make sure that the parking lots are not dark and magnets for illicit activity.
All right. Additional feedback, Councilmember Larson?
If I can understand this correctly, this lighting provision deals predominantly with the interface of public spaces versus private residential areas and the impact of light spilling from one to the other. And the design of lighting, once you get beyond that property line, may change depending on lighting design of that particular site and use, as you said, and what have you. So what we're really dealing with this ordinance is a issue of how public lighting affects private property. And I think that seems to be addressed pretty clearly here. I would agree with Councilman Clark that I think, and when you look at public lighting, we can't do it without the context of Duke Power. Unfortunately, Duke Power is sort of a whole nother world of negotiations, and that is the city's responsibility. And I assume that's a Public Works Committee responsibility. But I do agree that there needs to be some coordination or consistency between what we do on our city streets versus what Haynes Mall does, for example, in their parking lot where it butts up against a private residence. So I don't know whether holding this particular ordinance, I mean, we can certainly hold it, but, you know, eventually the question is what we're trying to accomplish. If this ordinance does what it seems to be designed to do, and that is public spaces, interface between private property and public spaces, and then deal with Duke Power on a separate ordinance, because it's going to take longer to deal with them, I'm afraid. But I do think we do need to address that because it's the same issue of light spilling on city, paying for light, whether it be in a park or whether it be on a street, spilling into a private residence and addressing that. So I'm not sure whether we shouldn't bifurcate this and deal with the street lighting issue, which is not addressed, clearly not addressed in this document, and deal with that in Public Works because it will not have to go to Planning Board. And we can get on with some guidelines, at least, to begin to impose, I'm assuming, on anything the city does as well as private sector does, whether it be our parks or Bowman Gray Stadium or tennis courts or whatever we end up doing, that this will be a new standard for lighting within our own house as we implement new plans or replacement of materials. And that seems equitable to me as well.
All right. With that, what's the pleasure of the committee? Are we comfortable moving this forward with the understanding we're going to bring something back specific to the concerns that were raised, or do we want to hold this to talk through those together?
Yeah, I can go either way on it, but I don't think there's any particular problem holding it for an additional month in committee to see what the report back would be on the street lighting question. Perhaps we can persuade Councilmember Clark that it's okay to move forward at that point.
I mean, I think some good comments have been made. One being that we're really concerned is when you have residential touching something else. But at least for my ward, and I think it's probably true in most wards, most of the outdoor lighting is city lighting, street lights, which are almost by definition all in neighborhoods. There are a few that aren't, but most of them are. And I do think that's the bulk of the problem. Obviously, there are shopping centers, usually smaller shopping centers that are near neighborhoods. And I will say the few that have been built in my ward since I've been here, we've always required they call them shoebox type lighting that doesn't light above and it controls it below. So I think it's been addressed, at least in my ward, on any new construction. But I do think, go out at midnight and see how many lights are going, and most of them are city street lights where residential property is concerned. And I'm not really concerned about Haynes Mall because I don't know if it backs up to any neighborhoods that I can think of, maybe a little bit there. So I would like to hold it a month, and I would like to incorporate in here something to do with street lights. And we keep blaming Duke. Duke will put up whatever we tell them to put up. We're paying for it. Well, we pay for it. Yeah.
All right.
They don't put them up unless we do.
We pay for it. Yeah. All right. Sounds like we'll hold this in committee, get that information back so that council members can have additional conversation in reference to it. All right. With that, I'm actually going to ask that the committee would allow. I know that Councilmember Clark may have to slide out, and there's one item I did want to get his opinion and thoughts on, and that's item G8. If you all would allow us to move item GA up, I'd like to hear some correct feedback on that one.
Item G8, update on Housing Finance Assistance Fund and funding affordable housing.
Good afternoon, Chairman Montgomery and members of the committee and council.
Good afternoon.
Before you have an update on the Housing Finance Assistance funding. Just a brief history of the fund. The fund accounts for city funds that are used for housing development activities, including home buyer assistance, new housing construction, neighborhood revitalization, and housing rehabilitation. Back in the 80s and 90s, 20% of the Article 40, 1/2 cent local sales tax was allocated to this fund. And that ended when the state had a budget crisis in 2002. And so the council and mayor and council approved some financial changes in March of 2016, that including setting a 14% of our unassigned general fund balance policy of our estimated expenses, as well as a transfer for the annual increase of unassigned fund balance to the Housing Finance Assistance Fund. And that was in amount of about 25% of the annual increase to that fund. So in your memo, there is a chart of the undesignated cash balance at the end of the year. Actually, I have a figure. But the main point is that the fund is declining. I mean, you see the line going down. The policy changed in 2016, so that's the first column, and it is declining ever since. The FY19, our current year, is approximately about $1 million in the fund, and we projected out the next 2 fiscal years, which includes potential commitments that would roll over from some unspent funds or commitments. So the fund is projected to be below zero by fiscal year 2021. There are some other funding sources for affordable housing. So we have the Home Fund, the Home Investment Partnership Fund, Community Development Block Grant Fund, which is called CDBG, Capital Projects Fund, the TURN program, and the 2014 GEO bonds was allocated to affordable housing as well. That funded projects like the 757 North, New Hope Manor, Ujima Retirement, and Ridgewood Manor. There is another chart that shows a comparison amongst 5 of our largest cities in North Carolina that shows the tax rate, our current tax rate for fiscal year 19, this current fiscal year. And so some cities designated a portion of their property tax rate for affordable housing. So you notice that Durham, Greensboro, and Raleigh designated a portion for affordable housing. Now, some of the other cities chose a few other options. So Charlotte and Asheville has a housing trust fund that they created, that they designate resources. Some of the other cities also do different things to add to their affordable housing. They offer low-income housing tax credit as an option. Some offer a local incentive for housing developers to include affordable units. There are a couple of community land trusts, that's in Durham and Asheville, and utilizing city-owned land for affordable housing development. That's it. Are there any questions?
All right. Are there questions? I have comments.
Just a question. I don't know, and I would suppose the council member has and others have suggested possibly adding some type of tax, half cents, 4 cents, whatever, to our budget to allow for affordable housing. Do you have any numbers as to what kind of funds could be generated to jumpstart an affordable housing in Winston?
Not right off, but I definitely can research that for you and bring some numbers back.
Yeah.
On like
1 cent brings what?
1 cent.
2 million.
2 million?
$2 million for our just general fund.
So 1 million brings 2, so 25% of 1 million.
$500,000.
$500,000.
Yeah, 1 cent on the property tax equals $2 million revenue,
Right.
approximately.
I'm looking at the figures a little bit, and from the 1980s and 90s, we're talking about 20% of 1/2 of 1% of the sales tax. Is that a correct statement? And that lasted until 2002, basically, when that program was discontinued.
Right.
So the amount of revenues that were being generated in the 80s and the 90s and all the way up into 2002 was whatever that 20% of 1/2 of 1 cent was. We don't have any idea at this point how much money that was, do we? I mean, you don't need to answer that right now, but it was apparently a fairly consistent amount of money based on 1/5 of 1/2%, 1 cent tax increase. Then in 16, we started trying to fill the gap with some funding, and what I guess I see on your chart, which picks up in 2013, is that our expenditures have consistently exceeded our revenues.
That's right.
So we had some revenue sources, or how are we making up that deficit from 2013 until now? If that chart that I'm looking at that says Housing Finance Assistance Fund revenues and expenditures, we are consistently above that, and so what are we doing about that? What happens in that gap that I'm seeing there?
So you're asking if we're using the revenue that comes into the fund for expenditures, and the fact is that the money that comes back into the fund is insignificant in comparison to what we pay out
What we're
for
paying
that,
out, exactly.
and that comes from the fund balance in the fund itself.
Yeah. And we generate some revenue from the housing loan repayments and investment income. So that closes the gap some.
But that gap has caused us to have this decline, which you saw on your second chart, is that even though we're generating some revenue, it's not sufficient for the amount of
That's
expenditure that we have, and we're tying into the fund to make up that difference, and the fund's now down to $1 million.
Yes.
Got it.
That's right.
So I would be interested to know what 20% of 1/2 a cent sort of would generate, because that seems to be a model that we used before. And I'd be kind of interested to know what kind of revenues. Obviously, our economy is a lot different than it was in 1990.
Right.
But using that model, what does that mean in the sense of even then, today, dollar differences, whatever?
Okay. We'll get that.
Mr. McClure?
Question and a comment. Do we have the authority to change the sales tax? I don't
No.
think we do.
No. No, we'd have to. It's just what we used to do is allocate the local part of our local sales tax. So we could reallocate what we already received, but that's just taking money from the general fund.
Okay.
Right.
But we don't specifically have the authority. Now, the county on your ballot when you get there in a couple of weeks is the county has a 1/4 cent sales tax increase to pay for the new Hall of Justice, but that's a different issue. I guess my general comment is we do budget every year. Matter of fact, our budget director is standing right there in front of us. And I do know Mr. Garrity and Ms. Tony do meet with each council member just prior to the budget season. And for those folks out there, our budget season is kind of April, May, and June. Officially, unofficially, y'all kind of start meeting after the first of the year. And I would certainly suggest for those that have an interest to bring this up, there's nothing prohibiting us from designating X percent of the property tax or X percent of the sales tax we receive for it. I do know we do specifically designate money to the debt service, which allows us to get a good rate on our bonds, because we do have, at least by ordinance, have designated the money to pay them off. So there's a specific reason for that. So I would certainly suggest folks look at that. Also, a last comment on your chart, we're currently designating part of, if there is an increase in the general operating account surplus, that we designate part of that. I think it's 25%. Does that happen very often? Because I don't see it on your chart that shows other funding sources. And the other thing that I can't tell from this chart is how much we get back in loan repayments. So those two numbers, are they in this chart somewhere, or I just?
It's in there, but I'll have to get you specific numbers because it varies.
Okay, if you can maybe just break those line items up, because those are two items, and I certainly realize designating a certain percent of the increase in the surplus would be an iffy number because we don't always have surplus.
Right.
So those are my comments. Thank you.
My comments are similar in nature, and wanted to make sure that we brought this conversation to this committee, following my heartbreaking proposal defeat at the council level, and in the not so many 4-4 votes we have on this council to allocate additional funds to the Housing Finance Assistance Funds for this very purpose, because of the chart that we saw here today that shows clearly that the fund in itself is not self-sustaining. It does not allow for us to live up to our strategic commitments that as a part of our strategic plan as a city, we have affordable housing and helping support and develop affordable housing for this community. And we have not put proper things in place to help us do that continuously moving over into the future. And so, yes, we'll have bond dollars that we'll allocate and that we'll be able to support, but ongoing on an annual basis, we have communities that are similar to ours that have bonds in addition to additional funding sources that we put in place. And we understand, again, that part of our challenge in what we face today in this community around developing affordable housing is that we have not produced enough affordable housing in the community at the pace and growth that's necessary to keep up with where we are as a city. And so we have to do something in order to do that. And so I will be here as a private citizen during the budgeting process, advocated alongside many others to see an opportunity to put something in place that moves forward. And I know that there's others who have talked about how we can move forward, something that we can allocate funds to move forward, because that then says to the public that our commitment is not just something that we talk about, but that commitment is something that can be tangibly found in how we spend our resources. If you want to know a person's priorities, look at how they allocate and spend their money. And so if this is going to be a priority of ours, I think that we need to allocate the funds necessary to do so, as well as examining what would not be a very popular decision with some community agencies, including some that I'm associated with, in terms of how we use community development block grant dollars. In particular, my support would be that we allocate community development block grant dollars for development purposes only, and not to support programmatic and operations for any organization, and that we give those organizations a 2 to 3 year understanding that after X date, we'll be allocating these funds for the purposes of investing in capital improvements for building and construction of affordable housing. Some folks will not like that because that has not been how we have spent our funds in the past. But when we look at the type of issues we face when it comes to affordable housing, I think those are some of the decisions that has to be made for the greater good of the community as a whole. And because today we dice those funds up, and those funds don't always find their way to the actual construction of physical properties to support their development. And again, that's something I would ask that this committee keep alive and have conversations in and around in terms of how our policy changes can actually have real-world impact on what's happening on the ground. And the last thing on this one is in reference to, when we look at other programs that are out there, such as TURN and other programs, I've shared this with the city manager, that conceptually these programs are good in terms of the impact that they desire to make. But we still face a grand challenge in terms of how they are actualized in the real world for citizens, how they engage, the timeliness of folks moving from point A to point B through a process, and us getting our bang for our buck in a timely manner through the TURN program and some of our other single-family housing programs, meaning we have funds in place to help support emergency rehab and loan programs that exist, but the time that it takes a person to get through that process is unacceptably long, and oftentimes we found ourselves dropping the balls due to personnel turnover and others. And the city manager told me we've supposedly gotten a control over those personnel turnover issues that we've had, and we're moving in the right direction. But I know I still hear some concerns from folks, and Councilmember Larson shares with me at times some of his issues that he's heard from others. So that's one that if we're going to put things in place, we have to make sure that we have the people in place to make sure that it runs the way that we need it to run. All right. Was there any other thing on the the funding pieces here that folks had comment on? Councilmember Larson?
There's one question I sort of have in trying to understand our position among our peer groups, and you give us a good database on our tax bases and how that taxes are allocated, and you give us indication of the amount of money, I think almost $4 million, I guess, in actual expenditures and whatever in this budgets and all the programs. I'm a strong believer in turn, actually. I think it can work. I guess what I'm curious about is per capita within the city structures and say what our population is and how much money we are allocating. We tend to do it in blocks of money, of bonds and other things. How do we compare with, say, a Greensboro High Point? If we were to look at the total amount of their allocation versus the number of people that they're serving there or the population of the city that they're trying to cover, how far behind are we in the sense of our commitment to provide housing to the broader population? And that would be a meaningful number for me to understand just exactly, if we start comparing ourselves to other cities, where we stand in the sense of serving the public in everything from the small homeowner in turns all the way to trying to develop housing and maybe in conjunction with housing authority or whatever that we're trying to do, with that full mosaic of the housing problems that we face. I'm trying to get a better handle on all of that. And maybe this is something for your committee to come back. If that data is not available, that would be a baseline that we could begin to measure progress against in relationship to dealing with this big elephant that we've got. Yeah.
Councilman Adams?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that you can see that the fund balance looks like transportation's fund balance every other year, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And every time we're not responding, we're always reacting to it when we see it in our face. And we even know it's like that, but we never put in the corrective action and have that difficult conversation with the community as to how important is transportation to everybody? How important is affordable housing to everybody? Because if those are the 1 and 2, 3 things that we said in our strategic plan, that we know that transportation and housing are the cornerstones of getting people out of poverty. It gets them to a job. It lets them be able to acquire wealth. But if we don't think that that trend line may change in the next couple of years, I think we have an opportunity to fast track council, whatever we're going to do. I do think we're in an emergency hands-on-deck situation. I think that us banking on federal resources, community development block grant and home is not the way to go anymore. And that's what we've been doing, Councilmember Larson, is we've been waiting on the money to come from the federal level when we all know that it's beginning to look like that might not happen anymore like it's been in the past. You can see the expenditures they've been giving. So I am in agreement with us looking at what we need to do, different scenarios, what we can do to make this better. Give us, like we said, the good, the bad, and the ugly, or give us good, better, best, like we do sometimes at budgets, so we can see what it is that we need to do to even try to get there, to try to get a handle on this, because we talk about affordable housing, but again, we got to put some teeth on this. We have to.
Councilman Clark?
Yeah. I also think we need to take a look at how we spend the money. The city of Winston-Salem is not in the housing business. We do not own and manage any apartments that I know of or houses. We traditionally have worked either through public partnerships. I can think of which is recently, and I don't know the names of all the apartments, the ones right at where 52 and 40 come together. We just designated a fair amount of money for those. I know there's some new ones, or at least a couple years old now, across from the new Atkins High School. And we've done an awful lot with the Housing Authority. Now, the Housing Authority, despite their name, the Housing Authority of Winston-Salem, is not a City of Winston-Salem organization. Matter of fact, this council has nothing to do with who serves on it. The mayor appoints the board, and we don't even approve it. Now, we do approve any joint ventures we do with them. But I do think we need to take a hard look at how we spend the money, because the only way you're going to get bang for your buck, in my opinion, is some type of partnership where our city money can be used to leverage additional money, given what's out there. But I think we need to recognize that we're not equipped, nor have. Lee, do you remember us ever managing and owning apartments? How long has it been?
I'm not sure we've ever managed them. We've been the owner of a few cases with the housing authority,
with the
but
housing
not
authority.
managed,
And I will say our relationship with the housing authority, everyone's a slightly different scenario. So I would just offer that as well as we begin to look at this on how we get our bang for the buck. And I use the term oftentimes return on investment, but investment return isn't necessarily a dollar return. A return may be how many affordable units do we get per dollar and things of that sort.
Right.
But anyway, I'll end with what I said is I do think the appropriate time to do this when we look at your previous idea is at the budget time when we got all the money, everybody's at the table, feeding at the trough, and we'll decide then how we do it. And I try to take everybody in consideration and come up with something that 4.5 people can agree on. Thank you. Yeah.
And as we prepare to transition, I will say that I think those are some things, and we have another item on here that I think will putting together a commission and others to kind of look at some things and examine and give us recommendations will be helpful. But just like those partnerships, we got to look at, again, how are we examining those partnerships down to the core of what is our return on that, and are those individuals who we currently partner with and we have funding with, do they utilize those funds currently to the best of their ability, or do they cost us funds? And there are some organizations today who cost us funds because we allocate funds to those organizations. They don't use those funds in a timely and appropriate manner, and because they're federal funds, we have to find some other way to expend them, or we don't get the drawdown, and they are kept federally, meaning that we have funds allocated to this community that don't get drawn down and they don't get spent in the city of Winston-Salem because the organizations that were supposed to be spending them didn't spend them. And so those are the kind of things that, there could have been an opportunity to work with others and other partnerships that could have developed to help make those things happen for our community. So I do think we do need to look at that and really set our objectives annually. How many affordable units with our funds do we want to create during the year, and who's able to help us create those units? So, all right, with that, we'll go to item G3.
Item G3, resolution endorsing the East End Master Plan.
Good afternoon, Chairman Montgomery and members of the committee. In late 2016, the S.G. Atkins Community Development Corporation and the Baltimore-based planning and design firm Ayer St. Gross partnered with assistance from the city to develop a master plan for the area bounded by US 52 to the west, Business 40 to the south, and Martin Luther King Drive to the north and east, known as the East End. The plan was developed over the course of more than 2 years and after significant involvement from a diverse group of community stakeholders, which included area business owners and residents in the area. In general, this plan calls for the East End to be developed into a vibrant, mixed-income and mixed-use neighborhood that is walkable, accessible, and livable. City staff has reviewed this plan and has determined that, by and large, it is consistent with the land use recommendations and the overall goals for the area as are conveyed in the Legacy 2030 update and in the East-Northeast Area Plan update. This plan was presented in its final form to the community at a meeting in August of this year, and just in September, the City County Planning Board did formally endorse this plan as a general guide for use in the future development in the revitalization of this area. Today, we have with us Carol Davis, who is the Executive Director of the S.G. Atkins Community Development Corporation, who spearheaded the creation of this plan to provide you a very brief overview of the key points of this plan. You do have in your item a full version of the East End Master Plan. There's a presentation that's at your places that Ms. Davis is going to be reviewing with you, and I'll make sure that all of you have it before I take my seat. But with that, I'd like to introduce Carol Davis.
Good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
Chairman Montgomery and committee members. I am Carol Davis, Director of the Athens CDC. I represent the Community Development Corporation at 1922 South Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. I also represent Winston-Salem State University, and we were thrilled to have the opportunity to work on this master plan in partnership, as Evan mentioned, with the city and with planners from Baltimore, Maryland. It was a little over a year in the making, and we had numerous community meetings and input sessions that have yielded what I think is a strong plan with a good framework and good steps for implementation. I think we looked deeply into the opportunities for this area, and what we came up with is consistent with what's in the East Northeast Area Plan, but we did take a deeper dive looking at housing, economic development, streets and sidewalks, parks and recreation, and public safety, and had input from residents, businesses, educational and financial institutions, nonprofits, property owners, county commissioners, city council members, and some of the property owners of strategic properties within the area. Around this East End area, which only makes up a small part of the East Northeast Area Plan, there are existing plans adjacent to this area with the Wake Forest Innovation Quarter, downtown Winston-Salem, of course, and then there is the master plan for Winston-Salem State University. All of those plans were considered in our process. Visioning sessions and workshops took place throughout 2017 and ended in August 2018. The guiding vision was to preserve the integrity of the community, celebrate the history and culture, identify catalyst projects, and at the same time be very cognizant of economic inclusion, coming up with a plan that did not displace residents, identify build first projects so that residents can be relocated within the neighborhood, and provide a mix of housing price points that address the needs, including students and faculty from Winston-Salem State. We wanted to create magnets and destinations within the area while making quality improvements on retail, entertainment, creating a town village center where our current East Winston shopping center is. We wanted to consider the incentives and opportunities that were available to spur additional entrepreneurship and business ownership within the area, as well as look at opportunities for expansion of perhaps the library with a civic hub that includes a continuing education center and spaces for entry-level startup space. So all of these things were considered and went into our conversations over the course of the year. And we came up with this framework that you see before you on this slide, which clearly shows where at the north part, we have institutional uses that will remain. We have in the pink, the predominant retail areas that will remain. And then we have in orange, the housing areas, which will remain but increase in density. And one of the highlights of the plan in this framework is the creation of a main street corridor that kind of divides the north and south areas of this plan with a mixed use boulevard type of pedestrian friendly and transportation friendly 5th Street, which is like a main street which we'd have mixed use with retail on the lower level and commercial and residential units above it. We'd have this enterprise zone, which would include a space for commercial businesses, including offices and co-working space. In the center, a civic hub, which is where we envision something like an expanded library with a continuing education center and some workforce development opportunities. And then the green spaces that would perhaps create some great connectivity from north to south for bicycles, for pedestrians, and act as a barrier from the highway while providing some green and recreation space for the community residents. Along Martin Luther King corridor, that would retain its vibrancy as a commercial corridor, and we would be able to increase the density of commercial activity along Martin Luther King. That tan area is single-family homes, where we've already started with the construction of some single-family homes in that area. And we are working with partners who are in control of the, my scroller has gone out of control. The orange areas are multifamily areas, predominantly Southgate Apartments, which is an existing community that has recently come to the city, I think, for some funds to completely renovate their housing. There's also Ivy Arms Apartments in this area, which are going to remain in the area as they are. And then there's Holland Homes in this area, which is also going to remain as it is with approximately 150 units. But we have opportunity to increase residential density and commercial density in this area. And those were some of the highlights. The way we would do that is by going to multi-story buildings. Mixed-use buildings that are multi-story and larger in scale to increase the density. We would work on a street network that would provide better connectivity for pedestrians, bicycles, buses, and cars. And on 5th Street itself, as this new main corridor, we would, this slide shows a wider streetscape with sidewalks, trees, and then the buildings pulled up to the street curb so that you would have more of a downtown urban feel. The existing configuration of 5th Street is on the right. And the, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with this thing. Okay. I take my hand off and it's...
You're not the only one having technology challenges. Existing configuration is on the right, with on the left showing a proposed, what the proposed right-of-way could look like that could accommodate pedestrians, bicycles, cars, parking, and buildings pulled up to the curb. And here's the vision for 5th Street, which is just a beautiful rendering of what 5th Street can look like with the buildings pulled to the curb, pedestrians, storefronts, streetscape, bicycle lanes, parking, and cars, all coexisting. I mentioned the connectivity of the area improving with pedestrian transit and bikes, an open space network that includes the greenways and the neighborhood park. And then our implementation for this obviously would require a collective effort. It's
hard to see, but on this slide in the lower right-hand corner, you can see where the single-family residential density would increase to 150 units, where it's currently right around 100. The multifamily residential units would increase to 1,100 units, where it is currently under 500. The commercial office space, co-working, and flex space could increase to 145,000 square feet, predominantly these light blue areas in the framework. And then a hotel proposed for near Winston-Salem State University, kind of adjacent to the intersection of MLK and Business 40. Also the Civic Hub in the center of all of this, pulling it together as a hub for residents, continuing education, and public space. And of course, the county facilities would remain as they are. They still envision this being their primary hub for their county services that will remain in place for future expansion. Some of the catalyst projects I've mentioned are the Greenway, of course, the 5th Street expansion, the Martin Luther King corridor being filled in with a mix of uses, a neighborhood park, and then, of course, predominantly housing, mixed income housing with more density, as I've described. As you can see, this plan is similar to the existing East-Northeast area plan, but what we did is go into greater detail and look at what's missing and what can improve the functionality of the area. The action requested is that you endorse this plan, the City Council endorse this plan, and that it be used as a guide for zoning decisions as we move forward. Any questions?
All right. Committee members, are there questions? Councilman Clark?
In the consultants you use, do we have any idea as a price tag and also a prioritization if you wanted to do X project first, second, third, or kind of how we build it out?
Mm-hmm. Well, the closest we have to that is the slide I showed you with the square footages.
Mm-hmm.
And if you use probably $150 a foot for new construction, I think we could easily get to millions, 30 million. At least we could easily get to 30 million in housing and commercial space, and not to include hotel, civic spaces, and some of the other.
And then as far as prioritization, is there some first, this would be the linchpin to get it going, or the catalyst, whatever term you want to use?
Well, I think we're starting with housing. I think we're starting with the housing and the commercial development. And there have been some conversations with property owners throughout the area about what they plan to do with their property, because obviously we need space to build. And so those conversations are in various stages, and as they mature, I'd have a better sense of what might be first. But there are definitely the multifamily housing that you could see closest to 52 is an ongoing conversation. I think there's some movement there. I think, obviously, Southgate is moving forward with their renovation, and we're looking at some properties in this enterprise zone and along Martin Luther King to determine the availability of those properties for redevelopment.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Adams.
Again, thank you, Ms. Davis and your Board of Directors. the community people, the stakeholders and everything for putting in the time to do this. I think, again, a lot of people misunderstand what it takes to do development. You know, when cities now have to rely on nonprofits and organizations like your own to help us do the planning with citizens' input as to where we want to go with this, I think East Winston is long overdue. I think if the people of East Winston and the city of Winston-Salem are truly interested in doing this, now's the time to go ahead and do it. You know, we can talk about gentrification and we can talk about missed opportunities, no opportunities, but it comes a point where we got to go to work. And this is work that has been done now for about 2 years. And I think what the East Winston community has is a start plan, and I'm glad to see it. And I'm just looking forward to when you can start building some houses. We just talked about housing, and how we know we got to get public-private partnerships to help us do it. And it's organizations like the Atkins CDC and others that will help make this happen in the East Ward community. So again, I'm looking forward to the work ahead. But just like you said, this is decades. This is not you go out in 2-3 years and we got all of this. This is building on a plan, a living document that can change as we go, so people understand that. They may decide they don't want to do something, they want to do something else, but it's within the framework. And again, I thank you all for doing this, and I just hope I'm around long enough to see it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Councilman McIntyre.
I want to piggyback on something as Adams just said about this being not a rigid, set in stone concrete plan. This is more of a guideline. This is more of a vision of what we want to see happen, because I think we've all seen master plans. We've all seen them change as economic times changes, as taste changes, things like that. But I do see a lot of things in this plan that I think are things that people in 2018, 2020 want to see, which is density, walkability,
Right.
Vibrancy, all those kinds of things that I think you see in successful urban settings. I see a lot of that in here, and I think that's a very much a positive thing. I think we've learned here in Winston-Salem, in the downtown area, that housing led, getting people living here, then allowed you to bring in retail, to bring in restaurants, to support those new residents. And I think residents make that leap into an area more quickly than businesses who have to spend a lot of money. So if you're talking about a rental versus putting a couple $100,000 into a business, I think you get more buy-in more easily. The $30 million figure that's thrown out obviously is not something the city of Winston-Salem is going to write a check for. We want to try to leverage some of our money to get a private developer to see this as an opportunity for them to make money, to come in and bring in their own capital stack and build from there on out. So I see lots of positive things in this.
Councilman Larson.
First of all, congratulations on I think, a very comprehensive plan. It does multifaceted, multi-populations involved, commercial, residential. I think it's great. I do think I love the idea of Fifth Street being the backbone of connecting across 52 and incorporating this part of town together. It excites me. I believe the city is committed to the success of this project. From what I've seen already, I believe we've allocated, $3 million recently, plus some administrative money for the next 3 years, so you can count that we're in the boat with you, at least for 3 years anyway. And I think that it gives us a roadmap that we've needed for a long time to address an area that's desperately in need of attention. I'm a little curious, and we don't need to talk about it today, but I'm curious about the boundaries and how they were set. I mean, obviously you don't want to bite off more than you can handle, but I am curious about what you expect. I mean, Martin Luther King, of course, is a major corridor, and we have one half covered and the other half not. And I'm kind of curious about how you envision eventually dealing with that road in the context of the overall plan of how this corridor will work. I know we're spending some effort to look at enhancements on Martin Luther King right now and what have you. So I congratulate you, and I'm certainly supportive of it, and look forward to hopefully seeing the results while I'm alive, and we'll look forward to that progress. Yeah.
Yeah, Billy.
The The presentation seems attractive, and I understand the process has been followed, and that this comes forward with the recommendation of the East Ward's council representative. I have no further questions.
Just a couple comments I would like to make in this process. One, thank you to the SGAC and CDC, the community members, and others who've been engaged throughout the process. But this has been, I think, a long time in process. If you all remember, even prior to my time on council, the city undertook an effort, which folks refer to as the Buxton Study, which went back to examine the leakage in the community, begin to look at, in this part of our community, where do people go for services, whether you're going to get your car fixed, whether you're going to get your clothes laundered, or you're going to get food. And it really showed the fact, one, that there were finances in the neighborhood, in the community, but people left out of the neighborhood to do almost everything that they wanted to do in terms when it came to quality of life. And on top of that, then we worked with, over the years, with the SGAC and CDC, and they began to examine the Martin Luther King corridor. And they develop out of the Martin Luther King corridor the streetscape and planning in terms of guidelines of what would happen. Out of that plan, it came up in terms of what would be catalytic projects in the Martin Luther King corridor to begin to help development in the area. Out of that was named a couple things: redevelopment at the Winston Mutual Building, redevelopment at Union Station were both named as opportunities for catalytic development. Currently, we're redeveloping the Union Station property, and the Winston Mutual property has been reinvested into as well. And I see this as a natural progression in terms of efforts that have been happening in the area to continue to build on. Our east-northeast area plan areas begin to look at very high-level, 1,000-foot, 10,000-foot level in terms of what happens. And to Councilmember Larson, your point, within the east-northeast area plan, it already kind of look at separating those areas and looks at the area east of Martin Luther King as being maintained as single-family housing, not to disrupt that neighborhood with development in terms of coming in and doing higher density, but to protect that neighborhood as single-family housing. But as you look to the west, that presented itself as a better opportunity as you began to look at redevelopment. Went through this process, engaging others and getting these resources together. And on page 19 of what we have, I think is probably one of the most important pieces for the citizens that live in the neighborhood and the community, because it outlines what we heard from citizens the most, that I think is necessary as a guiding principles moving forward. And that was that anything that happens in this particular area, these are things we need to think about: inclusion, affordability, equitable opportunities with first consideration for community residents, increase in minority ownership of housing and businesses, replacement housing without displacement of low and moderate income households through density increase, build first on vacant and commercial sites to leverage public and private resources. And we would look at subsidies, housing for lower income workers, reasonably priced options for younger workers and creative professionals, incentives for multi-generational housing, improved programs to retrofit housing for accessibility, buy local in terms of buy diverse, living wage jobs, increased number of minority-owned businesses, train and hire community residents in development projects, and expand arts and library programming. I pull those out to read into the record because when we were engaging with neighbors and folks in the community, these were concerns and hopes that came out of what would be opportunities for folks, but then also what their fears were in terms of how they could lose out on what could happen in the community. And the reason that we began to look at this planning was to try to somehow ensure that there's these opportunities exist for folks in the neighborhood and in the community because of the sensitivity of the history of the neighborhood and the community as a whole. And for that, again, this will be a years in the making, work that has to be done. We have to keep our foot on the gas to make sure that we keep moving. There may be some, as we've seen in downtown development and other areas, sometimes you have missteps in the process as you're going forward, but that doesn't mean you stop doing what you have to do. Dust yourself off. What do we learn from that project, and keep moving forward to ensure that we get what we need to do. This item was not presented as something that will go forward as with a public hearing, but I did ask the city attorney if we needed to have a public hearing on, because it was my thought we would have a public hearing on it. And from that, because of this being something we're asking to be endorsed as guiding principles and guidelines for folks in the development, that we should have a public hearing associated with that. So any motion for us to move forward today in terms of this resolution, I ask that we also add to that that it will have a public hearing associated with that.
Remember that, yeah.
Move
No.
to approve
With,
with the public hearing.
okay. Did you tap it?
I'm up.
I'm-
Let me show you how to work.
I'm not up, but I'm up.
No, you
So-
got it.
No, this, it doesn't have my second on there. Let me go back.
Dan,
Yep. So it's been moving properly second,
Yeah.
and all in favor vote yes. Because it's not, I'm not,
I've already voted yes. I don't know what's wrong.
you don't even.
I just lost. It's just something just popped up. I vote yes.
It's up there. It was in
unanimous. So that passes unanimously.
Okay.
All right. And with that, we will move on to item G4. Item G4.
Item G4, ordinance amending Chapter 86 of the City Code of the City of Winston-Salem entitled Zoning and Development.
Good afternoon again, Chairman Montgomery, members of the committee. In many ways, this item is essentially a companion item to the previous item you just reviewed. So back during the August meeting of this committee, staff was requested to investigate expanding the central business district as defined in Section 86-2 of the City Code to include all of the area within the Easton Master Plan boundaries for the purposes of economic development. And I'll show you a map that gives you some appreciation for the area that we're talking about here. As you can see, the north half of the East End is already contained in what is considered GMA1. The crosshatch area is the southern portion of the East End footprint, which by virtue of this and another action I'll explain, we'd be asking to include. I will also share at this point, wasn't depicted on the item that's in your packet, but did receive a request from Councilmember Larson as part of this item to consider expanding GMA1 to include this parcel here, which is, for your reference, on South Marshall Street, headed towards, I guess, Brookstown. Yes, Brookstown Avenue. It's the cross street here. So again, as you can see, a portion of the East End is already in the footprint. What we're asking for is the inclusion of the remainder of that footprint. So two things have to occur in order to accommodate this request for the revision to the map as depicted there. The first is an amendment, of course, to the section of the City Code which defines the city's central business district, which is the item that you have before you. The second item that would have to take place is a modification of Legacy's growth management plan map. And there is, should you elect to move in that direction, the mayor and city council staff would initiate such actions as required to make that amendment, which does involve an amendment process and public hearings as well. So with that, I'll pause and be happy to entertain any questions you have.
All right. Are there any questions? Is there a motion?
Would you like to explain why I added that little section? Anybody?
We read it.
You read it?
Yeah.
What's that? I'm sorry, Mr. Larson, what, you had a question?
No, I don't have a question. I requested that a piece be added in my ward, and I wanted to be.
Well, the only issue I have again, you said that this was asked for, but it wasn't brought to the committee or in our agenda package that we wanted to add it, and I don't have a problem adding it. I would just wish that,
I'd actually brought that up when this committee first recommended or proposed, if we go back to the minutes probably, the addition or the modification to include the other side of East Winston, East End. And I said I would like to add one small section to my ward as well, because it's so complicated to make these alterations that otherwise it'll never happen. So that's my request to you as council.
and I'm okay with that. I'm just hoping that they make the adjustment by the time we get to the meeting Monday. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
So we could bring this item along with the other item on November the 5th, and then I think the master plan might be
Ms. Carmen, we are going to planning board on Thursday of this week with the map amendment, and the map amendment that we are taking includes just the area in the East End plan. We do not have the part in there for Marshall Street. So the planning board staff has not reviewed that, or that is not included in the materials that are going to planning board on this Thursday.
Would you explain? I'm sorry.
Well, hold on a second, Mr. Larson. Did you there was a...
I'm making a motion on what has been presented to us based on the amendment to the section of the city code on the two actions. And if you look in there, there are items 1 and 2, and that's what my motion is.
Okay, there is a motion. Is there a second on the motion?
I'm trying to identify section 1. But that's just effective upon adoption.
That doesn't change, the item doesn't change the map. It changes the code for the definition.
Right, right. And that's what I was saying. We don't have the information. It hasn't been put out there. We can't add an amendment. We have to just make the motion on this if anyone's going to do it, because they have to take this to the planning board if we add any more properties and communities to it. So again, my motion.
Is it been seconded?
I'll second it. I'm not sure why there wasn't simultaneous consideration. When did this process begin on this particular modification?
2 months ago?
Yeah, roughly within the last 2 months.
All right. And Mr. Larson, your request was made at what point?
At that time, in this meeting, at that time, I requested of staff that they include that section south in the South Ward along Brookstown Avenue at that time, and it does not appear on the maps. So,
Well, and yes, I do recall a request, and I know as the chair, I made the specific request for this, and I know I reinforced the fact on what my request was specifically, in terms of looking at the plan, the East End master plan and components, and how the expansion impacts that area. But from what I understand, if that is a desire, there's nothing that stops folks from being able to consider that. Additional components, I think, even from a staff standpoint, is that, or at least there's a plan that goes in that talks about the redevelopment in areas specific to the East End. And I'm not certain that may be a difference in terms of those other parcels of impact for the Brookstown area. That's something that I guess they need to talk through more specifically.
Okay. My inclination would be to move forward with what's in front of us and request a report back from staff specifically on that item, so that the committee could make a fully informed choice at that point about the particulars of the request. I'm not sure why it wasn't, studied at the same time, but I don't want to hold up consideration of this change in order to insist that it be considered simultaneous. And if we hold this in committee, we'll be holding up consideration to beyond, the contemplated action window for this item. Does that make sense?
as long as the matter goes forward, it just seemed to be more expeditious to couple it into this particular action. If that cannot be done and it has to go forward as a separate request, then I would request for a second time that that be included as part of the Growth Management Area 1 plan, which is what's being discussed today. So, it's your committee's choice, but this seemed to me to be an expeditious way to deal with a very small parcel.
Yeah.
If we're not able to do that, then.
Madam City Attorney?
I was going to say, this item right now is just simply the amendment to the code to make sure everything that's in GMA 1 is considered to be for purposes of development in the Central Business District. The actual map itself is a separate item that's going before the planning board, and I guess to the extent you want to include this additional area in that process, Councilman Larson, that's probably where we need to work on that and let the East End area plan plus this code amendment go forward on November 5th.
I do not want, it's not my intent to hold up or bog down the process. I regret that it's not incorporated in these discussions over the last 2 months.
Okay, hold on. Let the attorney finish, and then.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
But I was just simply saying that I think that's more appropriate in the map amendment, because that's really what you're talking about, amending the map. You're not really talking about the East End area.
And this action isn't amending the map, and that's the thing I think we need to be clear, is the language. So this is not the map. So.
He included the map just to let you all know where the GMA area is situated. But the actual map amendment itself is another process that's going to the planning board. And what you're talking about doing or wanting to be done should be done through that map amendment process. And we can get together offline to talk about what we need to do to make sure your piece gets into that map amendment, which is where it belongs.
That'd be fine. Thank you.
All right.
Did you have a photo?
It's been moved and properly second. All in favor vote yes. Those opposed, no. That is unanimous. And so again, on that one, appropriate staff will make sure to get with Councilmember Larson on the planning board components, which the planning board would take up the map action to engage in that conversation. And then I also ask that at that time, in terms of whatever implications of adding those components, to Councilmember Bessie's point, that even if we do take that, to make sure that information is included in whatever we have going forward. All right. Item G5.
Item G5, resolution requesting the Forsyth County Board of Commissioners to evaluate the tax reevaluation process.
This is my item, Chairman Montgomery, and the only change, two changes to the resolution. If you'll turn to the top of the second page of the resolution, that whereas clause at the top of the second page, I had originally lease value there. I changed it to actual rental income to avoid any confusion, so it didn't appear as I was creating another terminology to be used in the appraisal process.
Got it.
And then also in the next whereas clause made it clear to Councilmember Clark's point that they should look at both the interior and exterior to determine, as a process of determining that, do those inspections, interior and exterior. It's a recommendation. Those are the only two things.
All right. Are there comments from the committee? I have. This was one of the items that I had requested for us to reaffirm as we sent a resolution to the county commissioners during the last revaluation process, asking similar items. At that time, even though we told them we were going to be submitting the resolution, they deemed it to be inappropriate at the time of its submission in terms of the request that we made should have been sent prior to their process of establishing how they would carry out the revaluation process. Subsequently, that the Board of Equalization and Review took up some of those items and did some review in those areas and made some report back, as I personally think was of not real value of what the core of what was being asked of. And so all this really does is, again, prior to them establishing their process moving forward, it reinstates the request that they take an examination of some of the areas that communities have stated feel disproportionately impacted by the revaluation process.
Cool.
So, is there a motion to approve? Is there a second? If not,
I can, but the chair may wish to.
I'll second. Is there additional comment? Councilman McIntyre?
Yeah, I won't be supporting this. I'm all for whatever raises our property taxes in the city of Winston-Salem, property tax values. The methodology, though, goes against kind of what I have been trained for years to look at. So I don't think, even if they pick it up, I don't think it's going to make a big difference. But I think there will be reasons that they'll come forth and show why the changes don't make sense or that don't work. So I will
And to my comment on that, and I understand those will likely be, I come down to the core of, I believe, the best practices that exist are wrong and have adverse impact upon communities, that if you utilize the methodology that is currently utilized has adverse impact on certain communities and neighborhoods, and I believe that we can be a catalyst to helping transform the process overall, which is not something that is just an issue here in Winston-Salem, but as we move up across the state and in other areas, the methodology that is used has similar impacts in other communities and other areas, and unless there's pushback on it, we won't even have the conversations on how we get to that. And so, I have a lot of neighborhoods and communities that have continued to remind me of that, and so I would be right to continue to push forward to make sure that we look at that. Councilman Adams?
Yes, and we respect what your how you feel and what your training is based on, Councilmember McIntosh. But again, this is America, and if we're not fighting for the people that want us to fight, and if we're not trying to change policy, this bad policy that outlives its purpose and needs tweaking, whether it's health care or the laws that we make on planning and including Councilmember Larson's neighborhoods. We have to do this because we've seen what it did, and it didn't come to everybody's realization until the housing bubble happened. And we felt, I guess, the system felt no need to audit for compliance to see if it was justifiably needed or needed to change. And I think the housing bubble is bad, the recession is bad as it was. It now lends itself to regular everyday Americans, working people that all they got is a house. That's how poor folk, we grow wealth. And if we're not willing as elected officials to fight for them, to fix this deal, then like Councilman Montgomery said, he's going to the State House. We're going to be fighting there too, and if other people get where they're going, Councilmember Bessie and some others, we're going to fight this one because we got an onslaught of America that's behind this one, Councilmember McIntosh. I just hope, that eventually we can find some ground that we can all agree on some of the things that we just need to change. And it goes back to when we do policy here, those things that affect the Northwest Ward and the South Ward might not affect the North Ward and the East Ward and the Northeast and the rest of us. And it may come down to that, where we have to look at communities for what they are. We're sitting here trying to put together a plan to help a community that I grew up in 50 years ago, to try to get them to the next level. And it's going to take all of us to do that. And I just believe that this is one of the opportunities we have in government to have a good discussion as we continue to discuss what we need to do to change this system. I think it's a good thing.
Councilmember Larson?
I'll be the first to acknowledge that I'm not an expert in real estate, but I do know that the market has changed significantly since the bust, and that the amount of people that are now living in rental units has increased radically, whereas personal home ownership has declined, simply because of debt loads and cost of mortgages and what have you that are now required. A number of properties now have been bought up by absentee landlords, and they are now renting those properties out based on the value that they think they can recover from that building. And I think if we then ask to get the true value of these properties, particularly that are now rental units, we have to go to the rental costs themselves as an indicator of what the landlords consider the value of these properties to be. And it seems a reasonable index to begin to look at that, at least. I'm not sure how it'll all pan out, but I think it becomes one of an indicator of how you assign a value to a piece of property. Location, obviously, size of lots, all the other things that we traditionally use. But we're sort of in a new era of real estate operations. And that rental issue is now becoming more and more predominant as an economic factor and indicator. And I think if we can figure out a way to acknowledge that, we're going to be better off in our appraisals.
All right. There's a motion and a second on this item. Are we doing the vote?
Oh, move forward.
No, we already did.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you just said you didn't have one.
We already moved forward, so that passes unanimously. And I'll have one last comment in reference to this, and this is in terms of why I think the process is aired and it puts the responsibility then on the property owner to come back and challenge the system in terms of that. And most folks are not going to challenge the system to pay more taxes and on their property, and then not understanding the questions of equity. And then I know folks say, well, folks don't use property values in buying and purchasing homes, Mr. McIntosh, but I mean tax values in that, but people do utilize those in some assessments and when they're looking at certain things. And I, at this committee, have used my own property as an example that it is hard for me to fathom the fact that two properties within a mile of each other could have the same drastic disparities, that a property valued at $150,000, revalued at $75,000, when challenged coming out and review the property, they say, yes, we made an error, and this should be another $75,000 more in what it's valued. And another property that is valued at $50,000, when I challenge that and come back and they say, you know what, this property is actually supposed to be valued at $225,000. That is absolutely crazy, and it's a mile from each other, and that tells me that there is something wrong in the process. When the same person can have that same issue and they come out and have that, something's wrong. And if we use any sampling and we get that in any statistic, it tells you got to look at something a little bit different. So, item G6.
Item G6, resolution amending the City Council's 2018 legislative priorities to include a bill to amend the city charter relating to the process for filling vacancies.
I'm going to try to walk you through the draft bill. Essentially, it changes the process for filling a vacancy where there's 12 months or more left on the term. Under the current charter provision, it provides for a modified election process, which council expressed dissatisfaction with. And so what this provision will attempt to do is when there's 12 months or more left on the term, council can call for a special election, primary and general election. Once that resolution calling for that special election has been passed and sent to the Board of Elections, essentially a primary will be scheduled and a general election will be scheduled. But before you get to that point, the Board of Elections basically would send out notifications that there's a vacancy on the board and that there's going to be an election process. And then the candidates or individuals who wish to be candidates for that election or that vacancy in the ward will have a time period, 14 business days, to basically file. And then once the filing has taken place, the Board of Elections basically has 90 days to schedule the primary. And that primary will be the same as any regular primary. And so a person who's not present in Winston-Salem or present in the ward will have an opportunity to fill out an absentee ballot. So that's for the primary. Then after the primary election's held, then there will be 90 days to hold the general election. So that's pretty much what I understood council wanted, which is a primary and a general election to fill a vacancy on the board. And so this would apply for any vacancy, either through death, resignation, or for whatever reason.
All right. Good question. Councilman Adams?
That's the first part. Another part. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I might be ahead of you. Section 2A, the second page.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just asking, is there a reason we have dates or?
I'm not explaining that.
Okay, sorry. All right.
No problem, no problem. Does anybody have a question on that?
Councilman Larson, did you have?
Yeah, so we've got a 90-day window for the primary, and then we've got another 90-day window for the election. Is that right? 180 days?
For the general election, yes.
For 180 days. And so we're dealing with 1 year vacancy?
You have at least 12 months or more left on the term.
12, but we could have 12 months, 11 months, but we're using up 6 months of those in elections. So it's getting to be a rather tight schedule, isn't it?
But you could have 3 years.
We could, yeah, you could. But the worst case scenario would be that you had 12 months, 13 months, and 6 months of those would be used up in election process, and then you turn right around and you are back in election again. Yeah, I mean that's the worst. That's the worst case.
Decide to do the appointment process, not follow it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the solution to that is. I guess that's just a choice. That's sort of what we face now. Okay.
Section 2, for any vacancy that occurred in 2018 or 2019, for which council used the appointment process. The residents of that ward could file a petition with at least 1% of the total number of registered voters in the ward in which the vacancy exists, as reflected by the voter registration records of the bipartisan state board of elections, to basically file a petition to call for an election to take place. But there has to be at least 12 months or more left on the term for that to happen. So in essence, this allows for an appointee of the council to the city council. If the citizens want to petition to have an election for that person who was appointed in 2018, 2019, the citizens of that ward could petition to have an election for that seat that was filled by the appointment process. And right now, it only applies to an appointment for 2018 and 2019. You can change that if you want to. That was just something I thought might be reasonable, considering we're looking at the potential of having 3 vacancies. But we can make it 2018 and thereafter. It's up to you.
Councilmember Adams?
No, I'm good.
Councilmember Bessie?
Yeah, I like the first part, but I'm not enthusiastic about retroactive changes that affect an existing term of office. I think that if you get your seat via the legal process in place at that time, there shouldn't be a special provision that applies to you. And I understand why it's being proposed, but I don't like that. I support the first part, but not that last section.
Other comments? I'm supportive of both because of what we heard, and if you were in the same room, what I heard from folks was the desire to have an election in reference to when we have vacancies. And what I made as a request to this council was hearing those things to then make that request that we would, one, look at an appointment using the current methodology that we have at hand, and then secondly, make the request that we would have that opportunity for individuals in the future to have the ability for a special election, and if appointment was used in this case, that if citizens wanted that ability to do so, that they'd have that ability to do so in this. I know there were some concerns about quote-unquote recall provisions openly there, and I think this doesn't mention that and doesn't get that, but this speaks directly to an appointed office for a very limited stretch of time in terms of how that would happen.
Yeah, and I understand the rationale, and from the folks who were present in the room during that discussion process, they were making points that would be congruent with what you're talking about. I'm not convinced they were representative of the general public sentiment, and I am moreover concerned about what amounts to ex post facto changes in the term of office for folks who take office under the provisions of the law that are applicable at that time. I think it's bad precedent.
Councilman Adams?
Councilmember Bessie, for the general audience, you need to make it simple. I don't think if you ask anybody in here what you meant, they know what you meant. You need to make it plain.
I am justly corrected, and I do tend to talk lawyer. I'll talk non-lawyer. I don't think it's fair to people who take office under the existing law to change the law after the fact and have it apply to them. It's the same principle that I thought was violated by the proposal of a previous representative from Forsyth County who introduced legislation that would have cut off 1 year from the terms of people that had been elected before.
Oh, yeah.
For the same reason I thought that was not fair to either the voting public or the people who had been elected, I don't think this is fair to a person that takes office under the existing rules. You're changing the rules after the fact. After the game's already been played, you're changing the rules.
Well, and I will entertain if someone wants to, bifurcate this into sections to look at it. But back to the point of what was stated and what brought forward was that it's different when a person is elected by the public in a duly called election and when someone is appointed in that time frame. And when you have which rules apply and whether or not you are stepping over public desire that is voted on at the polls by individuals, which I think is very clear. When people go cast that ballot, it is very clear that the public has spoken. When an appointment process is utilized in any methodology, that is not a clear statement in terms of what the greater, broader public sentiment is. And so although I understand exactly what you're saying, I don't think that goes against public sentiment because the public as a whole did not have their say-so in that process. But again, I'll be open to someone wants to bifurcate this and look at it in different ways on how we look at it, or not even include one portion and move forward with one other. I'm fine with however folks want to look at that.
I'll move that we recommend the parts of the resolution prior to that last section to it.
So you, excuse me, Mr. Chair, are you talking section 2? You talking section 2?
Section 1 in its entirety, and section 1. Excuse me, section 1.
That's what I thought.
Sorry.
Is there a second?
Well, I'll second it, but I need to ask the attorney some questions. I'll second. I second it.
Okay. City Attorney.
I need you to explain again 1 and 2 sections. What it is that we get with section 1 for the public, not us. And what does section 2 give the public? Minus the legalese, okay?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Section 1 basically gives the public, when a vacancy has been created by resignation, death, or however, the opportunity to have a primary and a general election. Council adopts a resolution basically asking the Forsyth County Board of Elections to start that process of doing a primary and a general election. That's what essentially council wanted, last month, but the existing local act does not afford a basic primary and general election. So that's what section 1 is about. Okay. Section 2 is essentially about vacancies being filled by the appointment process in 2018 and 2019. Again, because the concern was the public that were there at the meeting wanted an election, a full-blown election. Well, the local act does not provide for a full-blown election. So the thought was for those vacancies that are filled by appointment of the city council for 2018 and 2019, if the residents of that ward where the council member vacated the seat really want a primary and a general election, and there's 12 months or longer left on the term, they have a process by which they can call for a primary and a general election. It's only for those seats that were filled by council using the appointment process in 2018 and 2019. And I did review the legality of this with the General Assembly and the School of Government, and the process seemed all to be legal. It's just a question of what council wants. But again, part 2 applies for any vacancy that council fills using the appointment process in 2018 and 2019. It gives the citizens the right to generate a special election with a primary and a general election, if there's more than one.
Okay.
And there's a motion with a second. I will not support this alone because that is not what I went out after our meeting and told the constituents. I told them that I would be supported in moving forward something that did both of these things. And so that's what I shared with folks, and so I'm comfortable with asking for both of those components to be associated with it. And so if this is the only action we take, and I support us doing the full-blown primaries in that, but I will also ask after this that we consider the second piece separately, and if as something that we may or may not send forward to the full council, because again, that's what I publicly said to folks that I was going to do, and I want to live up to what I said I'd do.
Yeah, and I respect that. I don't object to having a vote on the second section, and understand your rationale. I'm going to vote no on the second.
Right.
Section. Yeah.
Councilman McIntosh?
I had a question about the timing on the second section. Is there a time frame associated with that 1%?
Let's see. I think the time frame is already in the general statute. I don't remember what it is, but there is a time frame.
Okay, so there is. So that couldn't occur sort of willy-nilly, just with somebody. Okay.
It's under the petition process. I think it was in the information I sent you all.
And my other question is there a precedent? Why was 1% chosen?
To make it less cumbersome for citizens to be able to generate a primary and general election, because that's what I heard was the citizens wanted a primary and general election.
Yeah. Is there an average number of voters in our wards? I mean, I know what the number is in my ward, but is that pretty constant? I mean, my ward is around 22,000. Is that
I don't know if it's constant.
fairly static?
Montgomery,
In the 2016 election, there was about, in terms of the total population, it's about 30-something thousand.
Right.
From the voters, there was about 10,000 some odd votes
11,000.
cast
Okay. So
in that election.
so you need around 1,000 signatures to do it.
Right.
Okay. Thank
plus
you.
1%.
Yeah.
And you're looking at the ward.
Right. By ward. Right.
Right.
Yeah,
And if
okay.
you recall, we did change our provisions in our, I think it was the charter, the percentages to equal the states,
Right.
even for like write-ins.
Oh,
because
yeah.
It was an extremely high number.
Yeah.
We had 25%, it was much less.
Yeah.
Yeah, to make it, within reach if that was something somebody actually wanted to do. Councilman Larson, did you have a hand up?
I have a couple of questions. This has to go to state legislature to be passed. In part two, is that basically, say, 2018 and 19, well, we're almost through 18 now. What happens in these cases when we've crossed the one-year threshold and we don't have a primary election component to it? That last 9 months, 10 months, is that still at the discretion of the council to make that appointment? Is that how that's going to work?
Actually, look at section 1.b. You're asking if there's less than 12 months on the term.
Less than 12 months on your option one, section one, I guess.
Second page, top.
Yeah.
And that would
It's
be
the mayor.
a mayor's appointment.
Right. The only thing I did was to change board to city council in that section.
Okay.
So that's how it currently reads. No one asked me to amend that section, so I didn't.
Okay. So the window that we have right now, has been addressed for Councilmember Montgomery's vacancy. But if we incur vacancies in the next couple months, and this has not been approved because it hasn't gotten to legislature, we're back still what we did before, right? And if we get through 19, or we get up to the one-year break point, then the mayor's going to make an appointment. Is that the way this will work? Even if this is passed, right? If this is passed.
If by the time this is passed, it ends up being less than 12 months left on
Any term.
Councilmember Montgomery's term, which I'm talking about right now,
Well-
then it would be the mayor, which is what it would be currently.
Currently.
If you decide to go by the local act, I guess you could always do the appointment process under the statute.
So I guess what I'm puzzling is part two, which Councilmember Bessie's worried about. Does that issue basically expire in 2020?
Yeah, basically.
I mean, that will not be an issue after 2020.
Right.
And we may get to that point even before then, the way things are going at the state legislature. Yeah, except when we get somebody down there to kick butt. All right. All right.
That'll be short-lived.
Yeah.
All right. I think I understand. Thank you.
All right. We have an item. All those in favor? Yes. Those opposed? No.
what are we
This
voting?
is just the first one, so so we're doing them in separate. So we're going to say yes, if you want to vote yes to have an election with the primary, then vote yes on this item, and then I'll make another motion on the second piece. So,
Okay.
all those opposed? That's unanimous. Move forward, council. And now well, does anyone else want to make a motion?
I move for approval of the motion, part 2, section 2.
And chair seconds. All right. All those was there any debate, any questions? All right, all those in favor vote yes. Those opposed, no. That moves forward, 2 in favor, 1 opposed.
So I'm going to do this as an A and B then, basically.
Yep. Yeah. All right. And then last but not least, item G7.
Item G7, consideration of items relating to the Winston-Salem Affordable Housing Coalition. Chair Montgomery and members of the committee, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
The item before you regarding the establishment of an affordable housing coalition is based off of the recommendations that came from our housing study. In September, our Community Development Director, Marla Newman, presented options to council as information for how we can advance some of the recommendations that came forward in the housing study. Councilmember Montgomery asked us to look at how we could bring forward establishing a housing collaborative or coalition so that we could look more closely at how we can advance affordable housing initiatives and also create some timelines and strategic priorities around the strategies that were listed as part of that study. The resolution that you have before you establishes a coalition based on those recommendations. The purpose of the coalition would be able to recommend strategies that expand affordable housing opportunities, engage supporters of and advocates for affordable housing, to coordinate and secure sustainable resources for affordable housing, and to advise the City Council on the use of city funds to support affordable housing development. We're recommending that the coalition consist of 11 residents and that the terms would be for 3 years. This coalition would specifically look at skill sets that we feel would be needed that are important to advance affordable housing. So we would specifically look for individuals with real estate, nonprofit development, for-profit development, social services, public health, transportation, finance, economic development, planning, public housing, philanthropy, county government, and faith-based service providers, experience in those areas to be members of the coalition. In the original resolution that was sent out, we sent out a modification today because in establishing the coalition, we did not initially stagger the terms of the members for those initial appointments. So in the revised resolution that was provided to council, when it talks about the membership and the term of office, the last sentence there notes that the members would be initially appointed with staggered terms, and this would allow us to have some continuity in the coalition as we're moving forward. Although the coalition would have 11 members, we realize that some of this work we may need to bring some other expertise into the group to help us think through some of the projects that might come before the coalition. So we do recommend that we would have work groups, established work groups that would be part of the coalition. There are 3 work groups that we have identified. The first would be one that focuses on housing stock. And then we have a sample of types of items the coalition members under that area would consider. For housing stock, it would be expand the diversity of housing types and locations, foster preservation of affordable housing, and expand community infrastructure so that we could expand the services. The second work group would be housing access and services. This would be for us to look at how do we develop long-term affordable rental and home ownership opportunities, develop rent supplement mechanisms, and also educate employers on the opportunities and benefits of employer-assisted housing. The final item under housing access and services would be educate housing consumers and providers on opportunities and responsibilities. The third working group is for us to think long-term about affordable housing in our community. And those objectives would be to design an integrated funding mechanism, realizing that we have to make sure that the financing is available for us to continue affordable housing development in our community.
for us to create public and private partnerships, strengthen those relationships so that we can have comprehensive housing strategies, and also for us to explore the viability of land banking and/or community land trusts to achieve greater long-term housing affordability. This is something that we're starting to see throughout the state. I think Asheville was the most recent one that had an investment of about $1 million from the city to start their land trust, and that's just getting off the ground there. As stated previously, the working groups would consist of those coalition members, but at the discretion of those members that are appointed by council, they would have the flexibility to bring in some additional members on those working groups to help move some of these items forward. This is a two-part action that's being presented to committee this evening. The first part would be just establishing the coalition based off of the guidelines that I've just provided with those working groups. And the second part would be to approve the ordinance that would actually add the coalition to the list of public bodies in the city code of ordinances.
All right, thank you. Are there questions? Comments?
I'll move approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
That's moving properly second. All those in favor vote yes. Those opposed, likewise. All right, that's unanimous. And again, I want to say thank you to staff and others for helping to move these items forward and through. Again, this just continues to build on the conversations we've had today, ties directly into the conversation we had earlier. And we would have followed with the conversation around the financing components, but I knew Councilmember Clark had to leave, and I wanted to make sure that his input was in that, that these things continue to build on one another as we move forward.
Mr. Chair, do we need a second motion on the ordinance change, or can that be included under the first?
That was all in one?
Very good, very good.
Okay. All right. So with that, I want to say a couple of things to you folks who are here today. You know, this is my last time looking at you all in this seat as chair of this committee, and so I just want to say thank you to the staff, to all the folks in community development and the department who have worked diligently, to the city manager and others who, your team and others who worked hard on issues that come before this committee, and to assistant city manager and others who worked hard on these issues. Thank you very, very much for that hard work and dedication to what you do. This committee in a short period of time has plowed through a lot and has pushed forward a lot in the midst of the last couple of years alone, whether it's the fact of being able to dig us out of a backlog of housing cases that we needed to find our way through that had been sitting on the shelf of not getting to us in reference to demolition cases that we needed to deal with. We had citizens looking at these properties every day wondering what's happening with these cases, or whether it's the fact of us being able to move forward affordable housing ordinances, moving forward affordable, our actual housing study to move forward to council for approval, and then the continued investment and support in affordable housing across the city, I think is something that folks on this committee and staff can be proud of as we move forward as a city. And I hope Vice Chair Adams and other members of the committee that we keep our foot on the gas as we move forward as a city in terms of being able to champion these efforts and many, many more. In the audience out there is the person who will come on this council in the future, Ms. Annette Scipio, who is here with us today. And I hope that the issues that are important to this community as a whole, she has all the wherewithal and ability to continue to champion those things in her own way to make sure that this city continues to keep its commitments, its promises to the city as a whole. So again, to each of you and all those on this committee, thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
I'll just say that the outgoing chair has been a lot more assertive and proactive than the guy that preceded him, whoever that was.
Good luck in Raleigh.
Well, thank you.
I just want to tell you, but I know we'll all say something probably Monday, that it's been a joy and a pleasure to work with you as the chair of this committee. And all the things we've done to try to make life better for people in Winston-Salem. Your shoes will be very difficult to fill. I'll try my best, and I'll be calling you. Trust me, I got all your cell phone numbers. But all I can communicate to staff and others that, again, Councilmember Montgomery helped us to see a light at the end of the tunnel in community development, housing, and general government. And let the record say that and history will be documented as such as well. You have a rich legacy left in the almost decade of work you've done here in the city of Winston-Salem, my friend.
Thank you. City Attorney?
Can I go back to business items?
Sure.
Sorry. Those two demolitions that you pulled off earlier, I think it was six.
C6 and 7.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. We have staff come up. I don't think they actually meant for them to be removed, just to make note that they were moving forward with BDA.
Here.
Okay, so do we need to affirm them
Need to vote on them.
on vote? So that means that items C6 and C7, that we approve them
With the BDA.
with the BDA, moving forward with the BDA.
Move for approval.
Second.
All in favor, vote yes. Those opposed? That's unanimous. So did you do both of them or just was that just C6? All right, C7, the same thing.
Right.
Only do that.
Second.
And those are the only two, right?
Yep, those were the only two. Okay. All right. With that, for the last time, we'll now consider the Community Development and Housing General Government Committee adjourned. And
Public Works will start on time.
Yes.